Good evening, everybody, and it's so nice to see you all again. Even on my screen, I don't see you very much at the moment, but hopefully later during the discussion we can see more of each other. And welcome back to our winter workshops on Fritillary meleagris, where we have been discussing our findings, sharing our view of and our findings and discoveries over several years. We have been all missing our glorious site. We were absolutely not allowed to go out and count fritillaries in 2020, which is a great shame. I was really deeply upset about that fact because the gap in data is never good news, but we couldn't fight any of this COVID bureaucracy, unfortunately. But we were allowed to come back in 2021. I wasn't there, but our small meadow team and the closest supporters like John and Anita and Anne and Graham and a few others, they were there helping us with the count. And it's for people who is not very familiar with the site. This is a map of North Meadow, which is a large ancient hay meadow near Cricklade, ancient Saxon town in Wiltshire. And we have on this site, we have 4 blocks of quadrats, which we monitor for botanical composition of vegetation conditions and status. But 2 blocks, block 1 and 2, that where fritillaries are counted as well, and they have been counted there for those 200 plots, the same in exactly the same location for last 22 years. What we have found so far, this is very basic overall graphs showing data for all observation periods in both blocks. And because our count includes vegetative plants, not only flowering plants, which happening often in many other sites when people want to count their fritillaries, they only rely on numbers of flowering individuals because they are easy to spot. Our task is more laborious, and we look for vegetative plants as well. But the information we collected, in my view, is really very, very valuable, because when I started looking at the ratio between those 2 groups, vegetative and flowering, there you can see the real difference, which bare species, total species number wouldn't tell you about. And if you can see my cursor, this is the years 2008, 2014, with exceptionally high number of vegetative comparing to the flowering individuals, and the same in block 2 in 2014, and where is it here, 2008, and that was a response of, there was a population responding to unusual, prolonged and really devastating floods happening the year before. If we compare 2 blocks, because the conditions there are a bit different, and in recent years our botanical data showed that hydrological condition, our botanical data showed that vegetation composition in block 2 behaves differently from what it used to be some years ago. And we can see on this graph that fritillaries are responding as well. My suspicion is that block is getting less well drained after the floods. And in 2021, we can see again very high ratio of vegetative against flowering plants, which is not particularly good news for the population, and also it indicates that the site is, the drainage there is not particularly good. So this is all quite preliminary data. We still haven't done detailed and analysis which this data really deserve. Well, hopefully we don't need another lockdown or any disasters to do that, and I will try my best to focus on this data in some near future. So biological flora of Britain and Ireland, it's called recently, not biological flora of the British Isles anymore. Don't ask me why, probably some of you would know the answer. I just know that it's changed. I just yesterday submitted the paper, which is, it passed through the reviewers. Their comments have been addressed, and hopefully the paper will be accepted for publication and will appear in some next, I don't know, 2-3 months. So that's the authors of the paper are shown on the screen. And to be honest, all our volunteers and all our entire team must be a co-author of this paper, but Biological Flora doesn't accept this number of authors as some other journals do these days. A couple words about what is biological flora. That's a very detailed account on particular species which contain a lot of information, and it's mainly based on literature review, because a lot of data on separate aspects of the species life, they are published through the time and in different places, different countries, often in different languages. So for a botanist or a person who is interested in this species, it's very difficult to get overview of those publications and build the picture of the species, not only its morphology, as it would be described in some floras, but also about other aspects of its life. British Ecological Society, Journal of Ecology, they started this publication, this series of paper in 1940s, if I am correct. So it's quite a long-term project. It's well maintained. At the moment, you can see it's 359 results sorted alphabetically. It's very easy to find the species you are interested in their database. It's regularly updated. Some of the species and some descriptions are so old that now I think editorial board considered they will accept the second publication on the same species if somebody wants to update the information which was published in 1945, as for the acers, for example. The main topics in biological flora format are presented in a very standard framework, and there is no escape from this framework, and sometimes it's really not very simple to understand which part of information would go into which of those sections you can see listed on the screen. And that's probably why this paper has 6 reviewers to read the account and produce comments and suggest to the authors what could be done differently and how, and very often it's a consideration of moving this part into some other parts, in other section of the paper because of this very strict format. And it starts, of course, with distribution, and here I fitted the distribution map of Fritillary meleagris, and we can see the number of dots is quite substantial, and we have some in Ireland and even in the islands in Scotland and the north of Scotland, but they are mainly, this map includes all known populations in any environment, native, non-native, orchards, roadsides, and so on. The map was taken from the recent publication by Kevin Walker, and here is the person who is responsible for describing the distribution of the species on the British Isles. When we look closer to the original native habitat for Fritillary meleagris as floodplain unimproved species-rich meadows, the number of dots reduce substantially, and they also diversify more those dots. Again, it's a work of Kevin Walker who suggested, as you can see, black circles, it's presumed native populations, gray circles, there is not enough information, but the populations might have been introduced there, and crosses on the sites where it's well known and documented that species were planted there. But I know that species, when we were doing our restoration project for 6 years, doing survey of restoration sites nationwide, I know that in several sites people were trying to add Fritillaria into the species mix to have them as a part of restored meadows, for example. If we look wider, slightly out of the British Isles, it's very approximate, very rough map, but shows the extent of geographical range of the species. And the most eastern points are in, in Siberia, and some records from Kazakhstan. But more populations and bigger populations occurred in Europe and in British Isles in particular. This map also reflects to some extent the research geography, as I call it, of the species. So as biological flora includes a lot of literature review, data from other publications. So here is a brief summary of which countries were doing some detailed research on which aspects of Fritillaria meleagris. It's not all countries are included. There were more countries, but this, which are listed, they've done more work than others, and you can see that UK impact was based on this genetic study by Peter Day. Peter came to our workshop 1 or probably 2 times. I don't remember very well, and there were big hopes and expectations from his work, but genetical studies of genus Fritillaria are proven to be very complex because of the enormous size of genome this species developed through its evolution. Not the species, the genus, but the species as well. Back to the UK, the snake's head fritillary has been a very popular species in this country. a lot of publications about it, but majority of it were concerned about is it native or not native? Could it be possibly which way, other way around or not other way around? And the discussion has been ongoing for many years, as you probably all know well. However, other aspects of the species life were left, should I say, unattended. Nobody even looked at it. And those one were individual life cycle, vegetative reproduction of the species dormancy, population dynamic, and pollination on British Isles remained largely unknown. And that's where our study made some difference, I would say, and somehow broke a little bit the tradition of biological flora being mainly literature review. Because in our project, which has been running over the last 22 years, a lot of data on all those aspects of the species life I mentioned before, a lot of data have been collected and looked at and processed, and some of them, some data were collected with the help of volunteers, others were more professional collection. But anyway, it's all this project which inspired the very insightful research into Fritillary meleagris on British Isles. And over those years, 290 volunteers have been involved, and 15 members of staff and students of the Open University have been supervising it at different times. So, thanks to our project, we were able to publish quite a lot of new information, which is published for the first time in Biological Flora. And I was a bit worried that editorial board of Biological Flora wouldn't accept it. They would argue that it's more about published research and published papers. And to my greatest surprise, they were incredibly happy, and the reviewers, almost all 6 reviewers, said, "Oh, that's wonderful to see so much new data, fresh look at the species, and some interesting insights in various aspects of it, its biology and ecology." So the response was very positive, and I was very pleased with it. And here there are 8 points listed, but there are more bits and pieces of information through the paper, which has been added because of our research in this project. So it was clarification of the life cycle, which before it was studied in the Netherlands, but it wasn't particularly accurate, and especially the finding about a singular leaf, which very often represent adult plant, and I called it feeding leaf, as helping to produce bigger bulbs for next years. It's about population dynamics, and there's a good discussion in the Biological Flora about importance of this ratio between flowering and vegetative individuals, and how it works in different parts of the species range and in different habitats. Differences in plant sizes in different habitats. The very much novel thing is prolonged dormancy. The paper I have published about this, but it's not, apart from our website, it's not probably easily accessible and easy to find on internet. So now it will be all information presented in Biological Flora. Miranda Dyson and the team of volunteers who were collecting data on pollination and pollinators, that's the information published for the British Isles for the first time in this Biological Flora. small data from seed germination experiment with competition on the float with the flooded areas, and just some notes about pests and grazers. So that's information, because we spend so much time with the species, so much time on our meadows. We have collected, well, I would say, expert knowledge of various sides of the fritillary life. And of course, Fritillary as the species of floodplain meadows and its adaptation to floodplain, to floods, has been outlined in this account. Here you can see quite different picture from what we normally see fritillaries looking like, in these very pretty flowers. And here it's with lots of sediments deposited by flood, but still coming through happily and nicely and getting ready to flower on Lugg Meadow. So in biological flora, this particular side of story hasn't been discussed in great details. However, our project on North Meadow and Lugg Meadow and Clattinger Farm, the aim was to see the population reaction to the different hydrological regimes. So our preliminary data analysis showed that plants clearly prefer well-drained areas comparing to the water with very shallow ground water level. However, we have data which deserve good, thorough analysis, and research paper is still on our to-do list. So biological flora doesn't include much on that, only general numbers from our counts. And here I'm coming to the end of my short presentation about what biological flora of Fritillary meleagris will tell us about. And I would like to highlight that understanding ecological system takes time, efforts, and dedication, and that's exactly what we see in our project, and with the help of our volunteers. Many thanks to all volunteers, and many of you are in the audience tonight, and all those people who have made this project work. A lot of thanks, and to reassure you that the project to be continued with your help, enthusiasm, and support in years to come. Thank you very much for your attention. You can switch my microphone off now, Emma.
Thank you, Irina. Now you need to keep your microphone on in case we've got time for a couple of questions, but thanks very much for whetting people's appetite about what's coming in the biological flora. And as you say, we hope that will be available online within a few months, and we'll certainly let people know once it is. Does anyone have a question for Irina? You can put your hand up, I'll try and spot you. An electronic hand, okay. Lawrence, go ahead.
Irina, you haven't got any, you didn't mention temperature, you always mention hydrology, and I find that temperature has a quite considerable influence on the on meleagris in various places. In my collection, I see quite profound differences between UK populations I'm growing, Eastern European populations, and Russian populations. And the temperature is the factor that would affect them, because in fact I'm treating them all the same in terms of how I water them. Okay, well, thank you, Lawrence. It's a really good point.
And indeed, when we had that collapse of population in North Meadow in 2013, we did look at the temperature impact, and the correlation was really strong. However, and at the beginning, I was very sort of enthusiastic and impressed and was thinking about applying that factor to the analysis more. But then I can't remember well now why, but I got a bit suspicious about role of temperature because I agree, the temperature is a key thing, one of the key things for Fritillaria. But as the same with hydrology, we need to ask the question at what time of year, at what time of their annual life cycle. Because in some periods when they are relatively dormant and not doing very much, I don't think they are really sensitive to the temperature. And in some other periods, they must be really sensitive. So that one is, it's a very good point, and we will definitely consider it in the analysis, but we haven't done much yet.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions for Irina? I've just picked up from the chat that the Hungarian presentation we were hoping would come next might be delayed because they're having internet problems. I don't know, Emma, whether you can check whether they're back online. But it does mean we have time for more questions for Irina, if there are any. If not, I'll just give a heads up to Richard that he's next on the agenda, so we can't go to Hungary. Okay, Richard said he's ready to step into the breach. But any other question on fritillaries for Irina? Okay. So I won't introduce the Hungarian speaker unless I hear otherwise from Emma. But if in that case we could move to Richard from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, who is a regular at these workshops and updates us each time on the data collected on bumblebees in North Meadow, and puts in the context of the wider work that the Bumblebee Conservation Trust undertakes. So over to you, Richard.
Excellent. So as David said, I work for the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and going back quite a long way now, BBCT have been collaborating with the Fritillary Monitoring Partnership to try and work out a little bit more about what's going on in terms of pollination, what bees are actually in the fields with the fritillaries, and how does that all work. And the main way that we have of doing this is via a scheme called Bee Walk, which we lead. I know many of you take part in this, but equally I know we've got a much larger group than normal this year. So I'll just outline it briefly. The idea is that volunteers go out and walk the same route, a transect, at least once a month between March and October, identify the bees that they see as far as possible, count how many of each species they actually see, and send the data back into us. And this is the only national scheme for abundance of a major pollinator group. This is the only way that we have really of detecting sort of population level declines over time and getting early warning of losses and what we need to work on and that kind of thing. But we can also use it to monitor how sites and groups of sites are changing over time, because when the monitoring has gone on for sites that are for a fair length of time, as it now has for the Fritillary meadows, we can start to pick up changes. And so we've got three transects, three sites across the Fritillary meadows. We have Clattinger Farm, we have the Lugg Meadow up in Herefordshire, and we have North Meadow that we've already heard a lot about already this evening. This is the Clattinger Farm. transect, and on that we've had pretty good coverage. Theoretically, if a walk was done every month, there'll be 8 surveys, 8 visits each year, and you can see decent numbers of individuals, decent number of taxa. I've called them taxa because that includes bumblebee spur, where someone wasn't entirely sure what species they'd come across, and a couple that are very difficult to split in the field, and so we lump them together, mostly the buff-tail / white-tail worker. It's both the yellow and the blue line. It's just I happen to have that transect section highlighted at the time for some reason. That's just section 1. So they walk out along the lane here, turn right, and then veer around the field edge down here. The second site is Lugg Meadow. As you can see, this looks a slightly more extensive transect. Go out in this big loop, a lot more sections, and correspondingly quite a lot of individuals, more species, more than one site visit per month for some months, so we've got quite nice data for it. But as you can see, unfortunately it hasn't actually been walked in the last couple of years, so at least if it has, the data hasn't made it to me yet. So whether that's a casualty of lockdown, I'm not sure. And the last site, North Meadow, that obviously Irina has just told you all about already. Really well covered in terms of number of visits, up to 20 visits a year, loads of individual bees and lots of different species as well. So if we compare the 3 species, the 3 sites side by side, it's quite interesting. You can see that Clattinger Farm goes along about 8 or so a year. By comparison, Lugg Meadow is noticeably higher, but possibly starting to drop off slightly even before we lose 2020 and 2021. And North Meadow is a lot more variable than either of the other 2. We've got these fluctuations, and on average it seems to be more or less the same, possibly declining slightly over the last couple of years. It's difficult to know because they've walked a slightly different number of times, and we'll look a little bit more into those in a moment. But we also looked at the number of individuals. Now, Clattinger Farm shows the sort of trend that we like to see. It's a nice increase from a relatively low base. This was, I think, 49 individual bees in 2013. But as you can see, it's gone pretty much solidly upwards since that point. We're now over 150 individual bees the last couple of years. Lugg Meadow, as you can see, is much higher. This black line here is the top of the Clattinger Farm meadow. This is 200 up here, and this is 200 down here. So you can see Lugg Meadow is noticeably higher, noticeably more bees per visit, or more individual bees in general, but is possibly dropping off, possibly stabilising somewhere around here. And North Meadow, again, we see it increasing up until about 2017, but then possibly the numbers are dropping off slightly in recent years. I'll talk about the national picture slightly later, but it varies. We are seeing a certain amount of that sort of pattern in general. Bees really struggled with the hot summers and the real heat waves that we had in 2018 and 2019 in particular, because there's not much nectar for them in really hot, droughted years. So we thought it might be interesting to have a look at how many individuals were seen per visit. Obviously, we have 7 visits a year. That's going to be a different number to how you get 14 visits a year. So we thought we'd standardise it a little bit more. You've still got Clattinger showing an increase. It's still noticeably increasing year on year. 2016 comes out as the best year, but 2021 is the second best, so it's quite promising. If we look at Lugg Meadow, these are all on the same scale now. So you can see again, decrease, but then this slightly worrying possible decrease 2018 and 2019. Whether, as I say, that's just from the really hot weather in those particular years is not entirely clear. But in North Meadow, we see a similar sort of pattern. Overall, again, we get that increase from the start of monitoring in 2013, up to about 2017, and then it just starts to drop off after that. That may not necessarily be something to be concerned about. It may be that some of the low number months, so March, April, May, September, October, where there just aren't as many bees out, were walked more, because in North Meadow we have more than one walk per year, per month in all of the years, but particularly in the later years. So the average per visit may well decrease if you're walking more frequently in those low intensity months. But it is certainly something which would be concerning. If I were managing this site, it would be something that I would be digging into in a little bit more. But overall, we have got quite a lot of species. There are 14 species of bumblebee recorded across the 3 sites, across the transects. They include 7 of the 8 common species. These are the standard ones that you'll get everywhere in parks and gardens, and without having to work particularly hard to find them. And there are some really quite impressive numbers of individuals, as I'll get to in a moment. And we've also got a reasonable number, 7 again, of these local or scarce species. This down here, Bombus rudderarius, the redshank carder, is a really nice species. It's quite widespread, but really quite patchy in its distribution. As far as we can tell, it seems to be quite restricted to quite high quality flower rich meadows and grassland. So it fits that it's turning up in the Fritillary meadows, and it's actually probably the best sites on our entire transect network. And we have about 600 transects in terms of regularly finding this species. So it's obviously doing quite well in those sort of areas, which is nice to see. And these species, these 6 here, are all cuckoo bumblebee species. These are actually parasitic on the social bumblebee species. They don't make nests of their own. They come in and take over the nests of other species. But slightly counterintuitively, we're quite pleased to see them, because you only get these cuckoo species in decent numbers where you have big healthy populations of the host species. They can't survive without bumblebees to parasitize, basically. So the fact that we're getting the full suite, all 6 British cuckoo bumblebee species, again, is a really good sign for the bumblebee fauna of Fritillary Meadows areas. So this is a bumblebee phenogram. This is the activity pattern, basically, across the year. Up the y-axis here, this is the number of bees seen per kilometre walked in each of the months. These are the months along the bottom. So you can see that they started a pretty low ebb in March, increased slightly into April, a bit more into May, really get going into the summer. June, July, August are miles ahead of everything else in terms of the number of bees about, and then drop off really steeply through September and into October. So, as I said earlier, if you're surveying more in these months, you'll get a lot more individual bumblebees per visit. If you're surveying in these months, you'll get slightly less. And that's important because obviously for Fritillaria, this bit here is roughly the key period. The flowering period for Fritillaria, April, May sort of time. It's the bees that are flying at this time of year, which are actually going to be contributing to the pollination of the meleagris. So we looked in a little bit more detail at which of the bees are actually about. So this is just for April. This again is bees per kilometre walked up the side. These are the different species along here. And there are only 3 species, Bombus pascorum, the common carder, Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, and Bombus licorum, the white-tailed bumblebee, that we were seeing more frequently than 1 bee every 2 kilometres walked in April. That's obviously not a particularly high abundance, but those are the species which are likely to be doing most of the pollination at this sort of time, because pollination is done by the things that are most abundant. It's all very well having rare species, and that's great in terms of the bumblebee fauna, but if you're a rare species, it's not actually doing much pollination because there aren't very many individuals in an area. So these are the most abundant species in April. They are likely to be getting a lot of visits. It was interesting looking at that. I was surprised that the early bumblebee was so low in here. I was expecting that to be much higher because, as the name suggests, it is a real spring specialist. But when we look at May, that species appears as the second highest abundance. So they're obviously just, they wait until May before coming out in big numbers. Again, we've got the common carder, the buff-tail, white-tail, but we've also got the red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius, and the tree bumblebee, Bombus tickle, again coming in quite big numbers. And these two in particular are real spring specialists, and it's not hugely surprising to see them. It's possible that Hypnorum, tree bumblebee in particular, isn't that much of a meadow species. If you look at it across everything, it's really, really abundant in suburban sort of areas in May and June. So it's slightly surprising to see it as low as it is in one of its peak months down here. But obviously, with these species being abundant, they are likely to be the species which are most important to the fritillaries. So looking at them in a little bit more detail, three of those species, three of the half dozen or so species which are abundant at the right time of year for the fritillaries, are actually increasing. These are trend analysis from the whole of Great Britain from our Bee Walk survey. This red line is basically the average number of bees of this species per kilometre. So if it goes up, it's increasing year on year. If it goes down, it's decreasing. So you can see they all have little wobbles. They have better years and poorer years. But on average, these three, the common carder, the buff-tailed bumblebee, and the tree bumblebee, show an increase year on year overall. These two, as you'll remember, are by far the commonest in both April and May. So it's quite good for the fritillaries that these seem to be increasing. But we also have, actually I'd forgotten I put this in, this was a last minute addition. So this is the phenogram, the within year sort of flight diagram for each of the species. This is the common carder, and you can see that just how much it ramps up. It'll be really abundant later in the season in these meadows. So it's just coming out. There's a lot of queen bumblebees around the Fritillaria time, but we've seen 2,800 exactly of these across the three transects. So quite a lot to go round. The buff-tailed bumblebee is a much more abundant species early on. The queens come out really early. I've actually seen my first for the year at the weekend just gone. So these are flying now, and then have this interesting drop off here because it takes them a long while to produce workers. So the queens either find a nest and tuck themselves up out of sight where you can't see them anymore, or unfortunately just die off, and you get this apparent decrease in abundance where you just can't see them, and then they rocket up once the workers start coming out. So again, reasonable numbers early on with potentially quite good pollinating species for Fritillaria, for the queens of this species at least. And the tree bumblebee here, sorry, I should have pointed out, the red line here is the average for the 10-year period, 2010 to 2020. The blue line is last year in particular, 2021. So you can see how the years compare to each other. So this again is quite an opportunist. It will come out on warm days in early spring, but doesn't seem to really do very much until slightly later, and then big numbers about in May and June. So there'll be some around, but nowhere near as many as for the last species, Terrestris in particular. But it is a species which is only going up in Britain at the moment. It's increasing in range and increasing in abundance. But on the flip side of that, there are also three species which are showing something of a decline over the study period 2010 to 2021. Not necessarily major declines, but declines in abundance are concerning, particularly when, as we've got here, they continue over quite a long time, because they are the precursor to declines in distribution. And obviously, once something declines in distribution and you lose it from an area, it's very, very difficult to put it back. So these are the species which are starting to glow amber on our internal watch list, really. So the red-tailed bumblebee, still a very, very common species all over the place, but you can see 2017 was its high point and it's declined pretty much every year since then, which is not great to see. The white-tailed bumblebee, again, pretty much a solid decline all the way across the years here. Particularly didn't like 2018. It seemed to suffer from the drought more than most of our other species. And Bombus praetorum as well, the early bumblebee, which can be really abundant at particular times, but only for a fairly brief window. You can see 2014, we had a really nice spring. It hit the perfect sweet spot for this species and it did really, really well in 2014 and then dropped off after that point. It's possibly recovered last year slightly, but it's not a brilliant picture for these three species. And if we look at those in a little bit more detail, you can see this one, if it, for argument's sake, were to disappear, that might not be a major loss for Fritillaria. There aren't very, very many at all about in this early period. And you can see just how much worse 2021 was for this species. It really didn't get going at all until quite late in the year because we had that long, cold, dry spring. The white-tailed bumblebee similarly never really got going last year. You can see it's significantly below its 10-year average pretty much every month all of last year. There just really weren't very many individuals around at all, and particularly in the spring. Again, not a particularly abundant species early on, picks up later. By contrast, the early bumblebee, I was surprised, as I say, that this was as low as it was because it is one of the quintessential spring species, and a lot of the spring flowers, I suspect this is quite important to its pollination. But last year really didn't like April because it was so cold for such a long time. It did catch up later. It had a much later season last year than it would normally have, carried on later. But again, reasonable sort of numbers of this about, but unfortunately a species which is showing a little bit of a decline in terms of abundance. So a bit of a mixed picture for the bumblebees on the Fritillary meadows. The key take home for me looking through the data is that they are clearly really nice sites for bumblebees, not just for the flora, but for the fauna as well. But there's possibly some work needed at some of the sites. North Meadow in particular does seem to be showing that decline over the last 4 or 5 years, which is concerning. And obviously it would be really great to get the Lugg Meadow transect back up and running. And I'm actually running a training course there in May, which I think some of you here will be coming along to. But that's me. So we've got a little bit of time for questions, I think.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Richard. I've got a bit of an echo. If somebody has got their microphone on, if I could turn it off. Could I also, just in preparation for the Hungarians who we're hoping to get to follow on here, ask people to turn their cameras off, because we're going to try and minimise the bandwidth that we're broadcasting. That might help them to engage and talk through their presentation. Thanks for that. But first of all, any questions? I see there is a hand up. It's Mandy Dyson. Go ahead, Mandy.
So I'm quite interested in your data for the red-tailed bumblebee, because when we, and I think John will back me up on this, when we worked on the meadows looking at the fritillaries in particular, so it was during April, the species that we saw so much of was the red-tailed bumblebee queens that were pollinating fritillaries. So it's really interesting that those transects are not picking up the red-tailed bumblebees, because if you sit and watch them, they're very, very common when the fritillaries are about. And I think John will back me up on that. So that was surprising for me.
I mean, we've got over 1,800 records of Lapidarius on those transects. So I think possibly it's just most of those are slightly later. But it would certainly be interesting to look a little bit more into the data and try and work out what's going on.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mandy. Another question from Caroline. Go ahead, Caroline.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just wondering whether you were getting many solitary bees potentially pollinating them as well as the bumbles.
Certainly, potentially, yeah. I didn't do any analysis. We do have some of the solitary bee records coming in through the survey, so they will certainly visit the fritillaries. The fritillaries obviously are quite big, quite accessible flowers to most pollinators, so they, both the solitary bees and other pollinators like some of the bigger hoverflies and that kind of thing, I'm sure will be doing some of that pollination as well. And it's important to point out we aren't looking at strictly pollination here. We're not looking at the carrying of the actual pollen between the flowers, just looking at the abundance of the bumblebee. So I'm sure there's a lot more to the story.
So we saw solitary bees pollinating fritillaries, and I think out of the counts we got, they were responsible for about 6% of the hits we got on fritillaries. About the same as the not bumblebees, honeybees. So you do find them, but not in huge numbers. It's mostly bumblebees.
Yeah, a lot of the early season pollination is done by bumblebee queens because they're so much more resilient to low temperatures and that kind of thing than most of the other pollinators that are about at that time of year.
Okay, thanks very much. Any other question for Richard? No, I can't see any more hands. So thank you very much, Richard, for that, for keeping us up to date. And it sounds like a bit of a mixed story, but excellent that the counts are still being done. So we encourage you to join the bee walks if you can. Yes, either get in touch with Richard directly if you'd like to engage outside our meadows, or with Emma if you want to join one of the counts within our meadows. Okay, thanks, Richard. We are going to try again with the Hungarian presentation.
Welcome, everybody. I would like to talk about Fritillary meleagris and its current status in Hungary with some insights from our work with this species. Can you please move the slides on the next one? Thank you. The distribution of Fritillary meleagris in Hungary has more or less two focal points. One in the southwestern part of the country and one in the opposite direction in northeastern Hungary. Although locally the species frequently form large populations, but in general it is still a rare species in the country and it is protected by law. Thank you. The next slide, thank you. In Hungary, Fritillary meleagris considered the species typically occurring in riparian forests, but is present in a number of other habitats. Here you can see some of them. Its largest populations, however, situated in floodplain meadows along rivers. Most of these meadows, however, are clearings of such riparian forests. The management of these meadows by regular cutting is favorable for this species. Can we move to the next one? Thank you. Here you can see a typical riparian forest near Lenti in Hungary, where Fritillaria is present in large numbers. Here the individuals are mostly solitary, not forming larger groups, but in overall the population here however, is still quite large. Next, please. Here you can see the habitat and the species. Next one, please. It's incredible that this thing works. Thank you. At Gyékényes in southwestern Hungary, there is a wet meadow near the river Drava with a large population of Fritillaria. You can see the forest bordering the meadow, where Fritillary is also present, but in a much lower density, just like in the forest near Lenti. Next one, please. Thank you. There is a similar meadow near Tüske-Szentpéter along another river, Zala, where the density of Fritillaria is also really high, as you can see. Next one, please. And thank you. The next one. Okay. With studying herbarium specimens, we can see that in Hungary, the flowering of this species peaks in the middle of April, and fruiting happens mostly in May. The next one, please. We started a demographic study with this species in 2017 using the Floodplain Meadows Partnership Snakehead Fritillary counting method. We installed permanent quadrats along transects on these meadows. We marked not only the position of the quadrats, but many of the plants as well, for easier identification of the plants. Next one, please. Wow. This is us during fieldwork in Gyékényes. Next one, please. Thank you. The high density of the plants makes measurement sometimes a little bit difficult. We try to counter this with little markers like little flags or other such equipment, as we need to know which plant were already measured and which is still waiting for its turn. Thank you. Next one, please. Originally, we wanted to install as many quadrats as it was needed to include more than 100 individuals in one sample site. On this graph, you can see the overall number of plants surveyed in a given year and the two size during 5 years in a row. Naturally, the number of plants in the quadrats changed over time. There is a distinct decline after 2017, which can be explained with the exceptionally wet February in 2018. These heavy rains caused both sample sites become waterlogged for a prolonged time, and many of the shoots in this year were destroyed. Next one, please. Thank you. You can see that as these habitats are floodplain meadows, this is not an exceptional situation. It also happened in 2013. Next one, please. Thank you. Here you can see the site in Tüske-Szentpéter in 2013 during the flowering time of the species. And here some local people performing a traditional land use. I will tell more about this soon. Here the original riverbed of the Zala River was clearly visible during these floods. Successful flowering and fruits that were possible only on the highest situated parts of the meadow. Next one, please. Thank you. You can see the level of the water was really high that year in April. After the water level lowered, people could find carps and other fishes laying on the meadow. Clicking, please. These are the kids hunting for fishes And another click, please. Here you can see carps and some other fish laying in the meadow. This activity, in fact, is forbidden in Hungary, but people still doing this traditional, interesting way of fishing. Next one, please. In 2018, this was the point where we changed our minds and decided to come back later. I know. And we are doing this presentation in blind, actually, for now. I can't see anything, but I more or less know which slide contains which thing. Can you move to the next one, please? And tell me when you're done.
I've moved on to the next one.
Okay, thank you. Sadly, this was the typical state of the plants in that year during the regular time of our survey. It was really difficult to still gather as much data as we could. Next one, please. After 2018, the number of plants were slowly increasing. The next one, please.
Okay.
There is 4 quadrats.
Yep.
Thank you. Here you can see the history of a randomly picked quadrat in 4 subsequent years. The green circles represent the vegetative plants and pink ones the reproductive plants. The size of the circle is in proportion with the number of leaves of a given plant. The ratio of flowering and vegetative plants change significantly every year, as you can see. Sometimes even the smaller ones start flowering, sometimes only the biggest ones. The number of juveniles or seedlings are also highly varying. Can we move to the next one?
Yep, done.
Thank you. In 2017, there was a census of Fritillary meleagris in northeastern Hungary as well. It provided us some really interesting information as the census was done in forest habitat. The differences between the structure of the meadow and forest population were really big. In the forest, most of the population belongs to the juvenile state, and the flowering plants made up a really little proportion of the population. In the meadow, it was the exact opposite. The proportion of flowering individuals were really high, and there were only few juveniles. In a given population, these proportions are more or less stable, but the rate of dormancy or mortality is highly variable. Can we move to the next one?
Yeah, done.
Thank you. About the pollinators of this species in Hungary, I cannot say very much as we gather such data only in 1 year, but still we could identify 5 species pollinating Fritillary meleagris. And if you click 5 times, I think, you can see these species in actively pollinating these flowers.
I have them.
And thank you. And thank you for your attention and sorry for the circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and well done to Judith and Bálint for managing to present that. Really nice pictures and very interesting to hear similar studies elsewhere. So thank you for that. I'll ask if there are any questions for you. Does anyone want to raise a hand? I was going to ask, are these sites quite well protected in terms of nature conservation designation?
More or less, yes. These meadows are part of the Natura 2000 system.
Okay. Good.
Thank you very much.
We have a question for you.
Yes.
From Anne. Would you like to go ahead, Anne?
Yeah, I was wondering how many sites you have where the fritillaries are growing in forests rather than in meadows. Is that a common situation or fairly rare?
In Hungary, it is not a very rare situation. In the northeastern part of Hungary, there are many populations located in forests and a few ones in our region in the southwestern part of Hungary. It is not a very rare thing in this country.
Thank you. And another question from Lawrence. Go ahead, Lawrence.
It's similar. I'm interested in this aspect of forests because you're clearly looking very much at the similarity of the meadows, but the meadows is the anthropogenic type rather than the forest. And I'm wondering why perhaps we're not spending a little bit more time thinking about the forest environment.
Sorry, but I didn't hear it very well.
I think Lawrence is asking why you've chosen to focus on the meadow habitat rather than the forest habitat with your surveying.
Yes, we wanted to compare with other studies done also on meadows, on floodplain meadows. So we started this study also in meadows, but we are thinking about maybe we can start another survey in forest habitats. It would be an interesting thing, as you can see the populations data gathered from such population in northeastern Hungary.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think it's interesting for us in the UK to see fritillaries in woodland because it doesn't occur here, but then we have very little woodland in floodplains, so there isn't really an opportunity for it. So thank you very much for persisting with that and for giving such an interesting talk. That's been great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our next presenter, who is John Barrett from North Meadow in Cricklade, who is going to talk about the management of the site there. So over to you, John.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everybody. Emma's asked me to give a quick update on the activities of Cricklade Courtleet in relation to North Meadow. Many of you may not be familiar with who Cricklade Courtleet are, but just to say briefly, we're an ancient manorial court who have been involved with North Meadow for hundreds of years, really. North Meadow is common land, and the role of the Courtleet was to actually manage the commoners and their grazing. Today we only have one grazier because you can't mix cattle very easily. So it's simpler in some respects, but more difficult in others. I want to say a bit about the grazing last year. Then I want to cover a project that we've been doing to improve the drainage of North Meadow, and then just to finish up with some species ID courses that we're doing on North Meadow later this year. So the grazing first. It's not an easy site to graze. We have to put out 2.5 kilometres of electric fencing to keep the animals on the site. The court members, of which there are 25, and they include people like the High Bailiff, the Steward, the Town Crier, the Ale Taster, the Affairer, and myself. I'm the Hayward, and I'm responsible for the grazing. We check the fences daily to make sure that they're operating correctly, to make sure that we look after the animals properly. We also install and manage 8 pasture pumps. The picture here shows a horse drinking at one of the pasture pumps. basically, if you're not familiar with them, the way they work is when the animal drinks from the reservoir, it pushes the yellow lever back, and then when it removes its head, the lever returns and pumps water up from the river to fill the reservoir again. We use these because it stops the animals from damaging the river banks, and also it stops sediment getting into the water, which is bad for the fish and other things that live in the rivers. Last year we grazed with 66 cattle for a period of 11 weeks from August to November, and also with 12 horses for 17 weeks between September and January. It was a good grazing season last year. It was relatively dry. Often the grazing is curtailed because the meadow is functional floodplain, and it floods at short notice, and often we have quite a lot of difficulty getting the animals off in time because it can basically turn into a lake very quickly. Moving on to the Eastern Ditches project, this project came about because the Floodplain Meadows Partnership in their annual monitoring report identified a reduction in species diversity on the meadow, which they thought was a result of the meadow being too wet and ponded water staying on the meadow for too long. And in 2018, seems a long time ago now, Natural England asked us to do some work on this and put a project together to actually carry out some maintenance work on the Eastern Ditches. These ditches are on land owned by other people other than Natural England, so we had to secure their support for the project. And we've been working with the Farming and Wildlife and Advisory Group to raise the money to do the work and indeed to manage the work. This is the North Meadow site, and it's quite complex from a drainage point of view. It's got the River Thames to the south, which is orange, the River Churn to the north, which is pink, and then the drainage ditches are the blue ones. And the meadow basically drains down to the Causeway Road, which is shown in white, and that acts as a dam, and the only way the water can escape off the meadow is basically through a bridge, high bridge, which is in the bottom right hand corner. This is a LiDAR plot of the meadow. The left hand side of the picture in red is the high ground. That's about 80 meters above sea level, and it falls by 2 meters to 78 meters above sea level at the bottom right hand corner, the blue area, and the dense blue area is where High Bridge is. The ditches that were identified as needing maintenance are the ones outlined by the red line, and we started work on the ones on the opposite side of the causeway to North Meadow, on the right hand side first. This is the work being carried out in September 2020. As you can see, they were pretty choked with vegetation. It was, I think it's 400 meters of ditching that needed to be cleared, and it took quite a long time and cost quite a lot of money to do. But it was carried out quite successfully. This is a shot of High Bridge looking towards the meadow. It's on the opposite side of the causeway to the meadow, and there was something like 20 tons of silt removed from this area. If you look at the bridge itself, you'll see there's a light area at the bottom, just below the top of the arches, and that's where the water gets to in the winter. So a lot of water passes this way. It's a pretty important drainage channel. This is the same area in December 2020, just after the ditching work was done. The meadow flooded as it normally does, and you can see these drainage ditches working well. We started on the other side of the causeway, pollarding the willows in October last year. You can see here a machine cutting the willows. It's quite an aggressive process, but the willows had to be cleared, and that enabled us to get access to the ditches so they could be reprofiled. That work has not been done yet. It's currently too wet, but we're hoping that that will be carried out later this year. And hopefully the result of all of that work will be that we'll see some improvement in species diversity, because the ponded water will be cleared more quickly from the meadow. Just to finish up then, we're running 3 ID courses, species ID courses, which is made possible by our Heritage Lottery grant. The first one is on the 14th of May and is being run by Richard, Richard Comont, who you heard from earlier, and he's giving us a workshop on bumblebee identification. The second one is the 11th and 12th of June. We have David Brown, who's the Warwickshire recorder for moths and butterflies. He's coming to do an ID course for us, and we're doing 2 field trips, one to Daneway Banks, which was where the one of the introductions of the large blue butterfly has been done, and we're hoping that we might see some. And the other field trip will be to Edge Common, which is in the same area. The third course we're running is on the 25th of June, and for that one we've got Sue Rees-Evans, who's the Shropshire County recorder for dragonflies and damselflies, and she's coming to do a damselfly ID course for us. So we're very much looking forward to those courses. If you are interested, you can find out the details on our website, crickladecourtleet.org.uk. So please go there and have a look if you think you might be interested. And they're also very good value because they're subsidised by the Lottery Fund. So that's my quick update, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, John. That was an interesting presentation, really quite a big piece of work there, and it looks like it will help the species richness of the meadow. Are there any quick questions for John while he's on? Otherwise, we'll move to Charlotte, if she's here, from Natural England, who was going to talk about, hi Charlotte, say something about the Natural England plans for the meadows. So thanks very much, John, and the floor is yours, Charlotte.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm the reserve manager for North Meadow. So I work for Natural England and I'm based at the Gloucestershire National Nature Reserve team in Stroud. So I thought I'd give you a quick overview of our plans for acquisitions around North Meadow. It's quite an exciting time at the moment. We've got a bit of money around, which doesn't always happen in Natural England. So the first area that we're looking at is Frogstham. So here's North Meadow, and this is Frogstham. It's 2.72 hectares. As I said, all the ditches on North Meadow drain through here. It hasn't been managed very well for the last sort of decade or so. It doesn't very often get cut, it doesn't get grazed. It's got a problem with injurious weeds. So the cutting that has happened infrequently has usually been a result of Natural England putting in a formal complaint to the owner, and then something happens. So we've tried to get our hands on it before, the most recent being in 2017, when we had the money to buy it but were outbid by the local school, who are the current owners. They put an application in to turn it into a playing field, which was turned down, and since then nothing's really happened to it. But this year we heard that it was probably going to go onto the open market, so we put in an offer and have had that accepted. we're currently going through the process of buying it and hope to have it completed by the end of this financial year. So this is really, really brilliant news. It means we'll be in control of the ditches. We'll be able to manage it more sympathetically. Our first port of call will be to finish the ditch work that the Courtleigh and Fwag started. We'll then be able to fence it and hopefully graze it and get it into a better cutting regime. There are indicator species in there for MG4 grassland, and there's a small population of Fritillary, so it will literally be an extension of North Meadow, and it will be declared as NNR, hopefully when it all goes through. So that's our first bit of hopefully really good news. The second bit is on a slightly different scale. This is very much in its infancy and may or may not happen, but talks with the landowner at the moment are quite positive. So this bit of land is called the Basin. So again, here's North Meadow, and this is the Basin land. It's owned by the Wellcome Trust. It's currently not in any kind of management. The most recent lease expired in January of last year, so it's had a year of no management at all. What we're hoping to negotiate is a 30-year lease for the whole site, and this includes this area here, which is Prior's Ham. This is an area that underwent a restoration project about 10 years ago. That was led by the Floodplain Meadows Partnership and Natural England. And even if we don't get all of it, we will try really, really hard to get this lease on this bit, because it can be managed in one with North Meadow, and it's already a successful restoration project. So we're really, really keen to make sure we get this bit. But the plan is to get the whole lot, and it's 60 hectares roughly, made up of 11 separate fields. We've had some soil sampling done in the past that has suggested parts of it could be restored to MG4, especially these two fields here, 14 acre and 25 acre. This year I managed to get hold of a small pot of money to do a couple of surveys. One was more soil sampling across the entire site to complement what's already been done. And then the second strand of that was a visitor survey on North Meadow itself, asking people whether, if they were given the opportunity, they'd use an alternative site to walk their dogs, because one of the major pressures North Meadow gets is recreational damage. So you get your local dog walkers who walk on the site, you know, once or twice a day, 7 days a week. So we were really keen to find out if there was an alternative, whether people actually would use that. And the overwhelming response was yes, they would. And the main factor that would affect that is whether they would be able to let their dogs off leads. So this new site would really, that would work really well. It's already divided into fields, so there's lots of potential for different routes we could put through there. There could be areas that you could separate dogs and livestock, and there's so much potential. And there's also so much potential to improve the conservation of this land as well. There's all the fields are bordered by hedgerows, there's wet flushes, there's bits of wet woodland. The areas up towards Cerney Wick are a bit drier and have got a really good potential for layback land, so improving the grazing offer for North Meadow. So the potential of getting our hands on it, both from a conservation point of view of the land itself, but also improving the recreational pressure on North Meadow, is massive. So that's everything I wanted to say. It's exciting times at North Meadow. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was, yeah, very exciting news. Very good news about Frog's Ham, and yeah, great potential if the bigger area does come off. Any questions? I mean, John's still online, or Charlotte, about North Meadow in particular? Yes, we've got a hand up. It's from Fran. Go ahead, Fran.
Yes, hi Charlotte. I wonder if you could comment on the proposed building that's going to happen to the south of North Meadow along that those fields.
Do you mean Stones Farm?
Yes, that's right, Stones Farm.
Yeah, so there's no application in at the moment, as far as I'm aware. We've Natural England have spoken to the landowner, Newland Homes, and we'll continue to, be in contact with them, and once there is an application through. But yeah, it's on our radar, and we will make sure that all the relevant surveys and everything is done, and we'll make sure that whatever the outcome is, it has the best effect on North Meadow possible.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we thank you to all the speakers for staying so well to time. We still have a few minutes before we're scheduled to end at 8. So if anyone would like to ask a question of an earlier speaker or make a more general point, feel free to do so. Emma's just posted in the chat a video that Anita Barrett made about Prior's Ham, so you can see how successful that restoration has been. Here we have a hand raised, Gareth. Go ahead, Gareth.
Yeah, it's a fantastic opportunity, Charlotte. This sounds brilliant, what you're doing there. A general question from any of the speakers, just interested in any information on wider implications of eutrophication on fritillary meadows at the moment. Is anything being done around that?
I can lead off on that. I don't know if anyone else wants to contribute, but we as the partnership have looked at particularly phosphorus levels in meadows, including the fritillary meadows. It is an issue, particularly following wet winters where there's a lot of flooding and a lot of sediment dropped, because river sediment tends to include a lot of phosphorus, probably legacy phosphorus from when our wastewater discharges weren't clean to the degree they are now. And you're right that increasing phosphorus availability on these sites stimulates the grasses, and many of the other species, such as fritillary, tend to be suppressed if the grass is very lush. And I think the only successful way of managing that is to make sure that hay is cut every year and cut early enough in the season to remove the phosphorus in the hay crop, and the system generally does then come back into balance. But the risk is with climate change predictions that big floods are going to become more common, and therefore this might be a more ongoing problem with sites receiving more phosphorus as sediment than they're losing as in the crop. So it's trying to maintain a balance between those two fluxes, what comes on and what goes off. But I think floodplain meadows are quite a resilient system because of the way they're managed. They're not suffering from eutrophication to the degree that some other species-rich habitats are.
Thanks.
I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that, or I see Matt, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So we've talked about the diversity of plants and bumblebees in this talk. I was just wondering if there's been much work done on other faunal groups relative to flower meadows.
There has for other invertebrate groups. There's somebody called Ben Woodcock from the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology who's looked at a wider range of invertebrate groups on some of the meadows around Oxford. I'm not sure if there's anyone on the session at the moment who can expand on that. There's also been quite a bit of study of ground nesting birds, and there is currently a project along the River Severn looking at curlew and their use of meadows. So I don't think anyone has done a very comprehensive analysis of the fauna, but particular groups are being studied in individual meadows. I don't know if Emma can add any more to the curlew story.
Well, not particularly the curlew story, but other than there's a sort of suite of lowland curlew projects, lowland meadow curlew projects going on in southern and probably northeastern England. But there is a brief summary of the types of fauna you might find in floodplain meadows in our handbook, and when we produced that in whenever it was 15, I think, and we did ask a few people to contribute to that, so there's a reasonable summary of what's about in that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other general points or observations? Miranda, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, I lost my connection quite a few times during the call here, but one of the questions was, Charlotte, you mentioned that the meadow is owned by Wellcome Trust. Seems very strange to me that they should own such a plot of land, but could this be opportunities? Are there many companies that own plots of land that can be turned into wonderful places for our fauna and flora?
Certainly around North Meadow, the Wellcome Trust own quite a lot of land, yes. As for other places, I'm not sure, but they're very, very, or at North Meadow at least, they seem very, very keen on forming the partnership with us, because it will help their charitable aims as well as our conservation aims. So yeah, it's certainly an opportunity at North Meadow, and I'm sure in lots of other places as well.
Just to follow up on that, I know quite a few companies that are looking to diversify in the ways that they want to help save habitat and not just have their own charities to help people. Could this be a good example of how other companies could look at Wellcome and see how they own land but allow it to be used in a good way for nature conservation?
Yeah, if it comes off and if it happens, then yes, it will definitely be sort of we'll use it as a flagship to, you know, show how we make it work, and it will be very much advertised, the fact that we're doing it in partnership with a big organisation like that. So we've just got to all cross our fingers that it all goes ahead, hopefully.
Thank you.
Just to give some background to that, I think the Wellcome Trust only bought it relatively recently. It was previously owned by the Co-op group as part of Co-op Farms, but I think the Co-op decided to sell when they were having their financial difficulties, and Wellcome bought it at that point. But yes, it's a good point that now there's more corporate responsibility in terms of the environment, whether other companies might be encouraged to do the similar things. Simon has his hand up. Go ahead, Simon.
Thanks. Sorry, just a quick observation on that discussion that triggered a thought in my mind. I was in another workshop this morning, and the discussion was around pressure on land and land acquisition for tree planting from companies and all and sundry to, you know, engage in carbon sequestration, which is fine, but that pressure is only going to increase. So I guess that's another driver to have a real flagship project, which is talking about grassland restoration rather than tree planting, to sort of fly that flag. So fingers crossed and a fair wind for you, really.
Thanks, Simon. That's an important point. And I know Natural England are concerned about ensuring that tree is the right tree planted in the right place, which in our view is not on meadows. There have been some instances where we've been alerted to trees being planted on meadows, which we're trying to gather data to show that that would actually be negative, not only in terms of biodiversity, but in terms of carbon. That these meadows store so much carbon that digging them up to put trees in, you would probably turn them into a net source of carbon. So although people are trying to do the right thing, they could have the opposite effect. There was a case of Severn Trent funding a planting scheme on a floodplain that did then get reversed, and they had to withdraw the funding. So yeah, we need to stay vigilant to try and pick up issues like that, because I mean, well-meaning groups are keen to plant trees, but trees are not the only way to sequester carbon, and they're often not the best, certainly in floodplain situations. Okay, we're just within a few minutes, but time for another general point if anyone wishes to discuss one. Or Emma, do you have any housekeeping points to make before we close in terms of how the recording for this session could be accessed?
Yes, sure. The recording session, the recording will go onto our YouTube channel, and then I'll share it around with everybody once it's been uploaded to that. And I've also put in the chat about our annual fritillary count this year on the 26th of April. If you're already on our newsletter or count list, then you'll get an email from us in the next few days inviting you to take part. But if you're not and you want to, then get in touch with me on the email address in the chat, and I can put you in on the relevant lists.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Any final points before we close? I'm not seeing any hands, so I'd just like to thank all the speakers for giving such interesting talks and for sticking to time, and particular thanks to those in Hungary who had to fight the technology to present the talk, but we got there in the end. So as Emma said, we hope to see many of you on the 26th of April at North Meadow for our traditional count, which will get back to normal post-COVID. Hopefully, we don't get another variant before that happens. So thank you all for your participation in this workshop. Some really interesting questions, and please stay on our newsletter list, and we'll let you know the plans for next year, whether we have another online session or whether we aim to meet in face-to-face in Cricklade again. So thanks all for your participation and for your interest. Have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.